At my husband's funeral, my son Julian stood at the podium, his voice thick with a grief I couldn't place, and thanked another woman. "She was the one," he said, his voice cracking with manufactured emotion, "who was truly family to us." In that precise, calculated moment, every eye in the hushed chapel, a sea of dark suits and polite sorrow, swiveled to the woman in the front row, to her, Serena Hayes. She sat there in a flawlessly tailored black dress that whispered expense rather than screamed it, her makeup a testament to waterproof perfection. A single, delicate tear rested on her high cheekbone, as if placed there by an artist. And me? Eliza Vance, the wife of 40 years, the mother, the architect of the very life they were mourning? I sat 3 rows back, off to the side, relegated to the periphery of my own tragedy. I had become invisible, a ghost haunting the edges of a life I had meticulously built. The true performance came later, at the lawyer's office, when Mr. Davies informed me, in dull, legal monotones, that my husband Arthur had left everything: the Westport home I had decorated, the Aspen condo I had never loved, the entirety of his personal fortune to Miss Hayes. I felt the air leave my lungs. Not a single dime for me, not a token, not a memory. As the words settled like acid, Serena Hayes, the usurper, turned, embraced my son, Julian, and smiled. It was not a smile of grief or comfort. It was a tight, triumphant smile of possession, the look of a predator that had finally, indisputably, secured its prey. They thought I was finished, a relic to be discarded. But as I sat there, invisible and erased, a cold, hard ember began to glow where my heart had been. They didn't know I was just beginning. I never imagined my life would begin anew at a funeral. Arthur died in a sudden, violent car accident. He was driving his cherished vintage Porsche, a car I always found impractical downtown, during a torrential October downpour. They said the brakes failed on a sharp curve on the Merritt Parkway. The car, a metallic blue blur, had crashed through the brick facade of a high-end boutique. He was gone instantly. The coroner, a kind man with sad eyes, assured me he didn't suffer. But standing there, listening to the platitudes, I found myself wondering, with a coldness that frightened me, if he deserved such a clean departure. We had been married for 40 years. 40 years. The words felt heavy, like stones in my mouth. I used to think our marriage, while long past the spark of romance, was at least solid. I pictured it as one of those old New England stone houses, weathered by storms, worn on the outside, moss growing in the cracks, but still standing, unmovable. I had surrendered my own ambitions for that house. I had been a promising financial analyst at his fledgling architectural firm, sharp and ambitious. But he had convinced me otherwise. "I can take care of you, Eliza," he'd said, his voice smooth and reassuring. "You don't need to work. Focus on the home, on Julian." And I believed him. I naively mistook control for care, possession for love. I traded my seat at the boardroom table for a seat at the head of the dining room table, ensuring every corner of our home was tended to, every social engagement perfectly managed, every crease in his suit pressed. At the memorial service, I wore his favorite charcoal gray wool coat, a garment I had picked out for him 5 Christmases ago. I stood by the chapel entrance, the wind whipping my hair into a frenzy I didn't have the energy to tame. My fingers were numb, whether from the cold or the shock, I couldn't tell. Still, I smiled. I greeted the partners, the clients, the distant cousins. I performed my role as the grieving widow, ensuring his farewell was dignified, orderly, and impeccably staged. Arthur cared so much about appearances, about the flawless facade of his life. Even in his death, I found myself maintaining that facade for him. Then, Julian was at the podium, our only child. He turns 33 this year, a data architect for some faceless tech giant in the city. He wore a sharp, dark suit that hung perfectly on his frame, a frame I had nourished from infancy. His face was solemn, his voice as steady and controlled as Arthur had always taught him to be. He read a prepared tribute, a sterile list of his father's accomplishments and civic virtues. He paused, clearing his throat, and his eyes, Arthur's eyes, scanned the front row. "There's someone," Julian said, his voice finally, purposefully shaking. "Someone I want to give a special thank you to." The room fell into a deeper silence. I clutched my handbag in my lap, my knuckles turning white, the leather creaking faintly. My heart, foolish and desperate, gave a single, painful lurch. I thought he was about to say, "My mother." In that suspended second, I could almost hear the word forming in his throat, that long-awaited, overdue acknowledgement. 40 years of companionship, 40 years of fevers soothed, homework checked, holidays orchestrated, and quiet, unseen sacrifices. I truly believed, in that moment of profound delusion, that he had finally seen me. But what came next was not a balm, but a blade. It sliced through me with a dull, sawing edge, stripping that fragile hope away, inch by inch. Someone who supported my father through the toughest times of his life, Miss Serafina Hayes. A soft, collective murmur rippled down the aisles. From the front row, that woman, Serafina, stood up. She didn't turn to the crowd. She simply rose, dabbed one perfect eye with a lace handkerchief, and gave a small, polite nod, as if accepting a modest award. As she sat down, those around her, people who had eaten at my table, turned to look, their faces a mixture of curiosity, surprise, and a dawning, prurient understanding. I felt sound detonate in my ears, a concussive, roaring silence. "Linda." "No, Serafina. Serafina Hayes." I knew the name, of course. She was Arthur's executive administrator at the firm, a title that seemed to change every few years. He later promoted her to a consulting partner, a move I'd questioned. He had even, I vaguely recalled, briefly included her on the board during some restructuring. When I'd ask about her, about the late nights, the business trips they took together, he'd always downplay it with a patronizing chuckle. "She's just incredibly competent, Eliza. Don't be paranoid, it's not becoming." I remembered, with a sudden, sickening clarity, the company Christmas party from 2 years prior. She had brought me a glass of champagne, smiling sweetly, her perfume too strong. She moved through the room with the practiced ease of a woman who knew she belonged, not as an employee, but as a co-hostess. I dismissed her at the time as just another sycophantic, ambitious employee. Looking back now, the irony was corrosive. From across the room, I heard someone whisper, a woman whose name I'd known for 20 years. "She's sitting so close, like she's family." And my son, Julian, had just thanked that woman, had legitimized her, at his own father's funeral. I felt the chair beneath me dissolve. My ears were ringing, and the world, the somber flowers, the stained glass, the pitying faces vibrated faintly at the edges. People came up afterward, pressing my numb hand, murmuring the usual empty scripts. "He was a good man. We'll miss him. A pillar of the community." I nodded automatically, a machine repeating pre-programmed responses, my smile cemented in place. I had planned to hold on, to maintain appearances until the last guest had left. But then, in the vestibule, as people gathered their coats, I heard it. I saw Julian walk over to Serafina, bypassing me completely. He placed a protective hand on her arm. I heard his whisper, sharp and clear in the sudden lull. "You're the one who's truly family. You were there for him." I nearly dropped the delicate, untouched teacup in my hand. In that moment, I realized this funeral wasn't for Arthur. It was for a hidden, parallel world I didn't know existed, a world where I was not the wife, not the mother, but a stranger, a discarded, oblivious observer. That night, back in the sprawling, empty house, I sat in the living room. The silence was an accusation. As I finally took off the charcoal coat, I saw that a satin ribbon on the cuff was wrinkled and torn, as if the last vestige of my marriage's dignity had been accidentally, irrevocably snapped. I sat at the mahogany dining room table, staring at the row of empty chairs. Arthur's seat, at the head, was still in its place. I hadn't moved it. For decades, he'd always sat there, hand on the carved armrest, waiting for me to bring him his soup, his coffee, his life. Now it was just a chair, and the armrest had gone cold. There were still bottles of his favorite imported beer in the fridge. I never liked the brand. It was too bitter. But he'd buy a six-pack every week, just for him. Turns out, habit is the cruelest prison, the one you build yourself, day by day, until you forget the walls are even there. I didn't sleep that night. I pulled out the old photo albums, the heavy, leather-bound tombs of our life. In the photos, we were still young. There was a different light in his eyes then, or maybe I'd just imagined it. I smiled easily back then, my hair short and my gaze direct. I even found my old employee ID from when I was a financial consultant at his firm. Short-haired, self-assured Eliza, always seated second from the right at every board meeting, the one with the sharp questions. Then he told me, "You should quit. I'll take care of everything." And I, foolishly, gratefully, listened. I closed the album, the thick pages landing with a soft, final thud. I poured myself a glass of water, the tap water I always drank while he insisted on bottled sparkling. The kitchen clock ticked, loud and indifferent. I realized all the pride, all the patience, all the resilience I had poured into keeping our marriage intact had been buried the moment he died. What I didn't know, however, was that beneath this cold ground of grief, a deeper, more profound betrayal was waiting to be unearthed. The next morning, every word I heard in the lawyer's office felt like a line from a life script I was never invited to read. The air in Mr. Davies's office smelled faintly of ink, old wood cabinets, and stale coffee. A faded print of the Constitution hung crooked on the wall, and the weak November sunlight filtered through the blinds, slicing the floor into narrow, accusatory strips of light. It was the law firm Arthur had designated, not the one we'd used for our taxes. Mr. Davies, a man in his late 50s with a slow, heavy voice, adjusted his glasses. Every syllable was drawn out, as if to underscore something unsaid. "Pursuant to the will signed by Mr. Arthur Vance 3 years ago," he began, his voice a mechanical, unemotional calm. "The majority of his assets, including the main residence in Westport, Connecticut, the vacation property in Aspen, Colorado, and the remaining balance of his personal and investment accounts, shall be inherited by Miss Serafina Hayes." I wasn't just stunned. I felt like I'd been physically pushed off the main stage of my own life, left standing behind the heavy velvet curtain in a dead spotlight, unsure if I had ever truly played the part I thought was mine. I turned, my neck stiff, to look at Julian. He sat ramrod straight beside me, his gaze fixed on the crooked print on the wall, as if he were listening to a quarterly financial report. His fingers were perfectly, calmly, interlocked. Not a hint of surprise. Not a twitch of the jaw. Not a shift in his expression. It was the calm of a man who had known all along. When the reading was over, when the last "therein" and "heretofore" had landed, I stood up. My legs felt like water. I walked over to him. "You knew," I said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, low and trembling. "Didn't you?" He finally looked at me, and his eyes were not those of my son. They were the eyes of a stranger, serene and slightly pitying. Dad had his reasons. "His reasons?" I whispered, the words choking in my throat. His reasons? What did 40 years of marriage mean to him? What did I mean? Julian was silent for a moment, the ticking of the clock filling the void. Then he said, his voice quiet but devastatingly firm, "He worked hard his whole life, Mom." He looked away. Serafina was there for him. She understood him. He lowered his voice, almost apologetically, which was worse. You didn't." In that moment, I saw it with blinding, agonizing clarity. Not only had I lost my husband, my home, and my future, I was losing my son. He wasn't defending his father's memory. He was defending his father's choice. He was redrawing the family tree, and he was erasing me from the map. When I got home to the house that was no longer mine, I stood in the driveway for what felt like an eternity. The weight of my handbag, a simple leather tote, felt like it was pulling my arm from its socket. I went into the bedroom and opened Arthur's closet. His shirts, ties, and wool vests were still perfectly arranged, exactly as I had left them, carrying that familiar, faint scent of cedar and refined decorum. But what lies, what deceits were woven into those cashmere fibers? When did he decide I was no longer family? Was it the year I forgot to buy his favorite wine for our anniversary? Or was it much earlier, the day I quit my job, the day I traded my calculator for an apron, the day I became just a housewife? I started searching. I was no longer a grieving widow. I was an auditor. I tore through the drawers, past the organized socks and cufflinks, looking for something. Proof I wasn't crazy. Old ledgers, photos, receipts, old business cards. In his pristine home office, in a locked drawer I'd never had the key for, I found it taped under his blotter. I found a folder. It was labeled Aspen. Inside were letters, not from a property management company, but to one. The date was 6 years ago. The recipient of the correspondence, the co-signer on the lease to buy, was Serafina. My hands were shaking. I had been to that house by the sea. No, that was the other one. The Nantucket one. From years ago. This Aspen one. I had never been. He always said it was a corporate development, too rustic for me. I realized, standing in the cold, silent room, I had been a guest in my own life. That afternoon, I walked across the street to visit Mrs. Holloway. She was a widow in her late 70s, with a sharp memory and a garden brimming with prize-winning roses. We had been neighbors for 30 years. When I mentioned Serafina's name, just a casual, "Did you ever meet a colleague of Arthur's named Serafina Hayes?" Her face stiffened. Serafina? Oh dear. She busily pruned a dead rose. Wasn't she the one Arthur would take to the symphonies in the city? The redhead? Auburn, I corrected, my mouth dry. Yes. I always thought they were an item, she said, raising an eyebrow, blissfully unaware of the bomb she had just detonated. You never seem to go with them. She's been on this street several times, you know. One year, I saw her helping Arthur put up the Christmas lights. I froze. That Christmas. I was stuck upstairs, recovering from a knee replacement. Arthur had told me a neighborhood boy, a teenager, had helped him. Do you remember when they started getting close? I asked, my voice strained. Mrs. Holloway stirred her iced tea, thinking, oh goodness, at least 10, maybe 15 years ago. I remember seeing her around here when you were away for that long stretch, taking care of your sister who was ill. I just thought she was some cousin or something. Pretty woman. 15 years. I sat in Mrs. Holloway's sunroom, surrounded by the scent of roses and lemon, feeling like a stranger who had walked into the wrong house, the wrong life. All these years, I had managed our retirement budget down to the last penny. I had chosen his bathrobes, scheduled his physicals, and even, 20 years ago, dipped into my own parents' small inheritance to rescue his company during a cash crisis. And he, all the while, had been methodically, quietly, building a golden future for another woman, out of my sight, out of my reach. Returning home, to that hollow shell, I went to the basement. I finally found an old cardboard box marked Firm Events 1995 to 2010. It was filled with dusty photos. And there she was, Robert Arthur standing next to Serafina at a company gala. His hand rested lightly, possessively, on her arm. He was smiling, a radiant, relaxed smile I hadn't seen directed at me in decades. He looked younger, happier, than he ever looked beside me. And then, one photo. Julian. Barely 18 or 19, home from his first year at college, standing with them at what looked like a summer barbecue. His smile was nervous, but not reluctant. One corner of the photo was marked. I rubbed the smudge gently with my thumb and uncovered a line written in Arthur's precise, architectural script. Our little family will be official one day. I could almost hear something break in my chest. It wasn't my heart, that had been numb for days. It wasn't glass. It was something deeper, something structural. It was the sound of 40 years of trust, 40 years of shared history, shattering into 1,000 million irreparable pieces, and it would never, ever be whole again. That night, I lit a single candle in the kitchen, and for the first time in this house without Arthur, I put on music. Not his classical, not his opera, but a slow, soft, unhurried jazz record I had loved in college. I started to wonder, maybe I'd lived my whole life to his rhythm, to his tempo, and I had never, not once, danced to my own. But not anymore. From now on, the music, the beat, the dance steps, it was all mine to choose. I thought the worst was over, the public humiliation at the funeral, the cold, brutal language of the will, the truth about the properties. Serafina, taking her place at the center of it all, brazenly labeled as family, that was enough humiliation for a lifetime. But I hadn't realized that what would truly, finally break my heart was Julian. He is my only child. I had believed that however unrecognizable the rest of the world became, he would still be mine. We agreed to meet at a sterile town cafe, the one with bad lighting where he used to get caramel desserts as a little boy. He showed up in a dark trench coat, his demeanor stiff and formal, as if he were preparing for a corporate merger, not a meeting with his mother. Before I could even sit down, he placed his phone, face down, on the table between us. He always did that. It was a subtle, dismissive signal that any buzz, any ping, could be a valid reason to abandon the conversation. "Why did you send Serafina a legal notice?" he asked bluntly, not even bothering with, "Hello." I took a deep breath, the air smelling of stale coffee, and looked him directly in the eyes. "Do you think I shouldn't have?" He shrugged, an uncanny echo of Arthur's dismissive gestures. "She didn't hurt you, Mom. Dad gave her the money. It was his decision. Suing her, contesting the will, it just makes everyone uncomfortable." "Uncomfortable?" I repeated, my voice cracking with a disbelief so profound it was almost comical. "Julian, your father deceived me for decades. I gave up my career for this family. I gave up my friends for you. I even sold my mother's emerald ring, the only thing I had of hers, to pay for your first year of college tuition when Arthur's investments went south." Julian frowned, exhaling with a visible, impatient irritation. "You always bring that up. You always bring up the sacrifices, like I owe you something, like it's a debt." That hit me like a dull blow to the chest. It wasn't anger, not even an argument, just distance. A cold, definitive, unbridgeable distance. "Dad told me," Julian said, after a pause, his voice dropping, "that the happiest years of his life were with Serafina. She understood him. She respected his vision. She didn't always question and criticize him, like you did." "I questioned him because he stopped respecting me," I said, gritting my teeth. "I criticized him because he was wrong, and his decisions were hurting the family he claimed to protect." Julian just shook his head, as if he were listening to a meaningless, old-fashioned sermon. You're too traditional, Mom. You've always believed that making sacrifices is a virtue, that suffering in silence is noble. But Dad didn't need that kind of love. He needed a partner." That's when I understood. This wasn't a sudden revelation for him. This was a narrative that had been fed to him, drip by drip, for years. He had been thinking this way for a long time. He just hadn't needed to say it, until now. I looked at him, truly looked at him, for a long moment. All I could see was the boy he used to be, the boy who breathed raggedly during terrifying asthma attacks while I sat by his bed all night, holding his hand. The teenager who was bullied in school, whose dignity I defended with a ferocity that surprised even me. The 17-year-old whose heart was broken for the first time and who curled up next to me on the backyard bench in silence, under the stars, until the sun came up. Did he remember any of that? I reached into my purse and pulled out an old, faded photograph. "That summer," I said, sliding the photo across the formica table, "when you were 2, we went to the beach. Your father backed out at the last minute for work. It was just the 2 of us. In the photo, he's a toddler in bright red swim trunks, standing on the wet sand with a trail of tiny, wobbly footprints behind him. You were terrified of the waves," I said, my voice soft. "You'd hold on to my neck so tight I could barely breathe, and you'd just scream, 'Mommy, Mommy!' You didn't know much about the world back then, but you knew where safety was." Julian looked down at the photo, his expression unreadable. He said nothing. "I know you idolize your father," I continued, finding a strange, cold calm. "He was always so elegant, wasn't he? Always perfectly turned out, never raised his voice, always said the right thing at parties. But did you ever stop to think that maybe, just maybe, I set the foundation for that elegant man to exist? That I was the one holding up the walls so he could stand in the spotlight?" He looked up. There were no tears, no remorse. Just a flicker of weary hesitation. "Dad did what made him happy, Mom. Serafina, she made him feel needed. You were always too strong." Too strong. That was my crime. I thought about those nights spent balancing overdue accounts while he entertained clients. The afternoons I cooked for dinner parties with a 102-degree fever. The years I held back tears at Arthur's cold silences and kept smiling anyway. That's what he meant by too strong. I carefully picked up the photograph, slid it back into my wallet, and stood up. My voice, when I spoke, sounded like it belonged to someone else. It was calm, but it had a deep, resonant firmness. "You're right, Julian. I was too strong. And starting today, I'll save that strength for myself." Whatever he said after that, I didn't hear it. I walked out the cafe door, into the parking lot. It had started to rain, a miserable, cold drizzle. The drops hit the windshield with a slow, relentless rhythm, an orchestra made entirely of silence. I slid into the driver's seat and wrapped my hands around the steering wheel, pausing for a long, long moment. I didn't cry. I didn't fall apart. I just sat there, realizing that what I had lost wasn't just a husband. I had lost my marriage, my home, my family, and even my son. But in that same cold, empty breath, I understood something else. I could no longer wait for someone else to tell me who I was or what I was worth. It was time to live for myself. At first, I thought Serafina was just a late-life accident in Arthur's story, a calculated opportunist, a woman who slipped in through the cracks of a tired marriage. But now, I see things clearly. She was never an accident. She had planned everything. On a rainy afternoon, I sat at my new, small kitchen table in my sterile rental apartment, a mug of cold coffee in my hands. I was looking at her public LinkedIn profile. Her profile picture showed her on a beach, smiling softly, the background edited with a tasteful blur, as if she didn't want anyone to see what was truly behind her. Her bio was a masterpiece of corporate euphemism. Consultant in the architectural sector, lover of classical music and community service, grateful for life's tender company. I clicked on her feed, her posts. The first image, Arthur, seated in a wicker chair, holding a slice of lemon pie she had apparently made for him. The text, "His smile is my favorite reward." The date stamp, 6 years ago. The same year I was bedridden for 3 months with a debilitating case of arthritis. Arthur had told me then that work was overwhelming and he would be traveling a lot. I believed him. I thought he was simply evading the burden of caring for someone sick. But now, I knew. He wasn't escaping from me. He was living with her. I scrolled down and found more images, both familiar and strange at once. There was Arthur standing in Serafina's living room, the aspen house and the wool jacket I had given him for Christmas. There he was, helping her plant flowers and arrange bonsai in her garden. And then, a video. Arthur, holding a glass of champagne, toasting her. A Christmas song played softly, and Julian was there. I froze. My hand hovered over the touchpad. Julian, who was still in college at the time, had slightly longer hair and a shy, boyish face. Serafina had her arm slung casually around his shoulder. She said, laughing, "Your dad should be proud of you, Jules." That's when I understood. Serafina was never just Arthur's secret. She had been positioning herself for years, not just as a lover, but as a replacement mother. And I was the woman she planned to displace. I picked up the phone and called Caroline Price. Caroline had been a close colleague, a fellow analyst, during my brief, bright years at Arthur's firm. She was one of the few women I had kept in touch with, however sporadically, after I left. She was semi-retired now, helping her daughter raise a grandchild, and taking on the occasional freelance forensic accounting case. She answered on the second ring, her voice holding the same sharp, no-nonsense energy it always had. "Eliza? My goodness! I heard about Arthur. I've been meaning to call you. I'm so sorry." "Thank you, Caroline," I said. I didn't stall. "Caroline, I need you to help me find something. I need you to look at Arthur's company books." She didn't hesitate. "Tell me what you suspect." I paused. My voice sounded calm, but it was firm. "I believe Arthur used company funds for at least the last decade to buy properties and fund a lifestyle for Serena Hayes. And I think there are other, unaccounted-for transfers." Caroline went quiet for a beat. "You're not just fixing a marriage, Eliza. You're looking to expose fraud." "I want the truth," I said. "I've spent too long in the dark." We agreed to meet at her house in 2 days. In the meantime, I became a woman on a mission. I went to the local library and looked up Serena's property records in Aspen. One house, a sprawling villa, under her name. Purchase date, 5 years ago. It was acquired right at the tail end of the company's executive housing benefits project, the same one Arthur was personally overseeing. I had visited the site of that project in Connecticut, I remembered. I'd joked at the time, "On the next trip you take me too." He'd dodged the suggestion. "You wouldn't like it there, Eliza. Too much dust." Now I knew. The room was not reserved for clients. It was for her. 2 days later, I drove to Caroline's house. Her home was a quiet suburban bungalow with a row of thriving chrysanthemums out front. She greeted me with a glass of lemon tea and opened her laptop. "I checked some archived payment records," she said, scrolling through 3 entries labeled Outside Consulting Support, Project Atlas. "But the beneficiary company, Quinte Consulting LLC, is a shell. No physical office is listed. Registered in Delaware." She zoomed in on one line. $50,000, paid the same month you were home recovering from your knee surgery. My stomach twisted. Caroline looked at me with concern from behind her glasses. "Are you sure you want to go through with this? Most people would just let it go." I didn't answer. I just saved a screenshot of the file to a secure flash drive. On the drive home, I went slow. The sun hit the windshield hard, and the air smelled of early autumn. The radio played an old 1960 seconds ballad. The chorus repeated softly, "You only find the truth when you stop pretending." Yes, only when you stop pretending do you begin to see clearly. Back at my rental, I sat in front of the computer and saved Serena's LinkedIn photos to a new folder. I named it Evidence. I was no longer the woman who buried her emotions behind a stove. I was Eliza Vance, the legal wife of Arthur, the mother of Julian, the one who had been edited out of her own life story, and I was the woman who was about to rewrite the ending. The second batch of documents from Caroline arrived just as I was wiping down the kitchen sink in my small apartment. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting clean stripes across the countertop. I paused for a second with a rag in my hand and thought that was how my marriage had been maintained. Tidy, silent, until the kitchen no longer felt like mine. The email subject was simple. 3 suspicious transactions. Key: preliminary legal feasibility assessment. I opened it. A few familiar PDF statements filled the screen, but now they were annotated in red. Caroline had traced the shell company, Quinte Consulting LLC. The account was tied directly to Serena. The transfers: 3 large payments, totaling over $350,000, carefully staggered over 5 years. Each one was timed just outside the company's official quarterly audit cycles. Caroline added a note. "This sum lacks sufficient justification. Unless invoices for services of equivalent value can be produced, this is potentially embezzlement disguised as a fraudulent gift." There it was. The proof. The truth, in black and white and red. I felt a knot of cold, hard resolve form in my chest. I knew exactly what to do. That afternoon I called a lawyer. Not Mr. Davies. I called a lawyer who specialized in forensic accounting, fraud, and corporate law. "I have a whole host of questions," I said, my voice steady and clear. I believe my late husband systematically plundered his company, a company I still hold a minority share in from my time there, to aid his longtime mistress. The lawyer was a woman named Eleanor Bishop. She was in her mid-50s, and her voice on the phone was warm, but all business. She listened calmly as I talked, not interrupting once. "You need to send me everything you have," she said finally. "Every document, every email, every photo, especially the ones with the dates." I hung up and started copying the files. When I was finished, I had over 50 documents, cross-referenced and dated. I printed everything out, arranged it neatly in a folder, and took it to her downtown law office. Her firm was in a glass skyscraper, and I took in the view of the New York skyline as I waited. When she walked in, she had a kind, professional smile and a sharp haircut that framed her chin. She wore a perfectly fitted suit, a suit of armor. She took the folder, flipped through it for 10 minutes in silence, and nodded. "We will go through this," she said. "I'll be in touch." "Thank you," I said, looking at her, a professional woman, the kind I might have become. She betrayed me, and my son helped her. I want her to pay back every last cent. Eleanor pushed her glasses higher on her nose. "We will do our best. The truth is a powerful motivator." The next few months were a whirlwind of appointments, emails, and legal proceedings. We filed a lawsuit, not just against Serena Hayes, but against the estate, claiming fraudulent conveyance and breach of fiduciary duty. The case made waves. Arthur's former firm, his partners, and even his estate lawyers became entangled. And then there was Julian. He took Serena's side publicly. He was outraged. "You're destroying his memory." He yelled at me on the phone, the only call I received from him in 6 months. "Julian, your memory of your father is a fairy tale," I said, my voice shaking but firm. "He was a con man who used money to betray me, his wife, and his son's mother. That is the truth." He hung up. I waited for him to call back, but he didn't. It hurt, a deep, primal hurt, but I did it anyway. I had to. The case went to court. It was not a jury trial. It was a bench trial. Just a judge. Serena and her lawyers tried to paint it as a misunderstanding. They claimed the funds were legitimate payments for consulting services. They produced fake, backdated invoices that Arthur had clearly given her. But we had Caroline's evidence. We had the financial trail. And we had the LinkedIn photos, date-stamped, showing a personal, not professional relationship. I took the stand and told what happened. I didn't cry. I simply stated the facts. I talked about the 40 years of our marriage, about the financial sacrifices I made, about my own career I'd given up, and about the pain I felt when I learned the truth. The judge, a woman in her mid-60s with intelligent, tired eyes, looked at me with a profound, quiet understanding. I think she understood what goes on in the hearts of women like me, the two strong ones. In the end, the judge ruled in our favor. She ordered Serena Hayes to pay back everything Arthur had gifted her from company and commingled accounts, with interest. The total sum was just over $1 million. Serena had to sell the Aspen property, the one bought with stolen money. She was broke, she lost her job, and her carefully curated reputation was in ruins. I never saw her again. As for Julian, he didn't speak to me for 3 years. Then, when my father, his grandfather, died, he called me. We met at the funeral, 2 grieving people on neutral ground. We embraced, awkwardly at first, then tightly. We began seeing each other again, tentatively. I told him the whole story, not with anger, but with the facts. He started to understand. It took years, but we mended our relationship. He apologized. He said he was only defending an illusion, the illusion of the perfect father he'd needed. I hugged him and told him that I had believed in him, the real him, the whole time. Last week, I hosted a small party in my new apartment. It's smaller than the Westport house, but it's all mine, and the view of the city is spectacular. My old friend Caroline was there. My lawyer, Eleanor, came. Even Mrs. Holloway made the drive. We were celebrating my new beginning. I had gone back to school, gotten my financial accreditation back, and started a small consultancy, helping other women, mostly widows, navigate their finances. Julian walked over and hugged me softly. "Mom," he said, smiling, "when did you get so good at giving speeches?" I smiled back, handing him a glass of wine. "I always was, sweetheart. You just weren't listening." We both laughed. Everyone laughed. That night, when everyone had left, I folded up the chairs and put them away. The porch wind chime tinkled softly in the breeze. I turned to watch the sunset, the sky bleeding orange and purple over the skyscrapers. It rested above the steel and glass, as if to say, "Who are you really?" I took off my heels, walked barefoot into the house, hung up my dress, and went to bed. I knew who I was. I was a survivor. I was a fighter. I was an analyst, a mother, and a friend. I had been a character in Arthur's story for 40 years. But now, I was the author of my own. And the truth, I realized, hadn't just set me free. It had allowed me to finally, truly, begin.